Hashtag, how 8,000 soldiers annihilated 40,000 Ottoman troops. The brutal ambush of Albulena. Picture this. It's September 2nd, 1457. You're an Ottoman soldier marching through the Albanian highlands, part of a massive army 40,000 strong. The sun beats down mercilessly as you trudge through narrow mountain passes, your armor weighing you down with every step. Your commanders have assured you this will be an easy campaign, just another routine expedition to crush the Albanian rebels once and for all. But as you enter a valley surrounded by steep cliffs and dense forest, something feels wrong. The air is too quiet, the birds have stopped singing. And then, from the heights above, you hear it. A war cry that chills your blood, followed by the thunder of rocks, arrows and screaming warriors descending upon you like the wrath of God himself. Within hours, your invincible army will be reduced to a field of corpses, and the man responsible for this catastrophe will become a legend that echoes through the centuries. This is the story of the Battle of Albulena, one of the most devastating military ambushes in medieval history, where 8,000 Albanian warriors led by Skanderbeg didn't just defeat an Ottoman army 5 times their size, they utterly annihilated them. Now, before we dive into the blood and chaos of the battle itself, we need to understand who Skanderbeg was, because this man wasn't just any military commander. He was a tactical genius, a master of guerrilla warfare, and quite possibly the Ottoman Empire's worst nightmare. Born as Gjergj Kastrioti in 1405, Skanderbeg had a complicated relationship with the Ottomans, to put it mildly. As a young boy, he was taken as a hostage to the Ottoman court, a common practice the empire used to ensure the loyalty of conquered territories. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of breaking him, the Ottomans trained him. They educated him in their military tactics, their strategies, their weaknesses. They turned him into one of their finest generals, giving him the name Skanderbeg, which roughly translates to Lord Alexander, comparing him to Alexander the Great. The Ottomans had essentially created their own nemesis, and they had no idea what was coming. In 1443, Skanderbeg did something that shocked the entire Ottoman Empire. He defected, he abandoned his position, returned to Albania, and united the fractured Albanian clans under a single banner with one goal: to drive the Ottomans out of his homeland forever. And for the next 25 years, that's exactly what he tried to do. He transformed Albania into a fortress, using the mountainous terrain to his advantage, launching devastating hit-and-run attacks and frustrating every Ottoman attempt to reconquer the region. The Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same guy who conquered Constantinople in 1453, became obsessed with defeating Skanderbeg. It became personal. The man who had conquered the Byzantine Empire, who had achieved what Muslim rulers had dreamed of for 8 centuries, couldn't defeat one Albanian warlord in the mountains. That's the context we need to understand the Battle of Albulena. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was a carefully planned Ottoman campaign to end Skanderbeg once and for all. So let's set the scene properly. It's the summer of 1457, and Sultan Mehmed has had enough. He assembles a massive army. Estimates vary, but most historians agree it was somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 men. This is a serious force. We're talking cavalry, infantry, archers, the full Ottoman war machine. He places this army under the command of Ishak Bey and Hamza Kastrioti. Now, Hamza is particularly interesting because he's actually Skanderbeg's nephew, a member of his own family, who had remained loyal to the Ottomans. Talk about a family feud taken to the extreme. The Ottomans are confident. They have the numbers, they have the experience, and they have detailed knowledge of the terrain. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. And it did. Skanderbeg, on the other hand, had maybe 8,000 men, some sources say even less, around 6,000 or 7,000. He was outnumbered at least 5 to 1, possibly more. Any conventional military commander would have retreated, avoided battle, maybe tried to defend a fortified position. But Skanderbeg wasn't conventional. He had spent years studying Ottoman tactics. Remember, he used to be one of their generals and he knew their weaknesses better than anyone alive. He understood that the Ottomans excelled in open field battles where they could use their superior numbers and cavalry charges to overwhelm enemies. So he decided to do the exact opposite. He would choose the battlefield, dictate the terms of engagement, and turn the Ottoman strengths into fatal liabilities. The location he chose was absolutely brilliant. There's a valley near the village of Albulena, also known as Ujabada, which means white water in Albanian. This valley was a natural kill zone. Steep mountains on both sides, narrow passes, limited room for maneuver, and most importantly, it was the perfect place for an ambush. Skanderbeg positioned his forces in the heights surrounding the valley, concealing them in the dense forests and rocky outcrops. He divided his army into multiple groups, each with specific tasks. Some would initiate the attack with arrows and rocks, creating chaos and panic. Others would charge down the slopes at precisely the right moment to maximize the psychological impact, and Skanderbeg himself would lead the final devastating assault that would shatter whatever remained of Ottoman morale. Now, the Ottoman commanders weren't complete fools. Skanderbeg favored ambush tactics. They had scouts, they had intelligence, they should have been cautious. But here's the thing about overconfidence. It makes you careless. When you have a 5-1 numerical advantage, when you've just conquered Constantinople and half the Balkans, when you're the most powerful military force in the region, you start to believe your own propaganda. The Ottoman commanders pushed forward into the valley, perhaps believing that Skanderbeg wouldn't dare attack such a superior force, or maybe thinking they could crush any ambush through sheer numbers. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between fighting in open plains and fighting in mountain terrain against an enemy who knew every rock, every tree, every hidden path. As the Ottoman army entered the valley, stretched out in a long column because the narrow passes didn't allow for any other formation, Skanderbeg gave the signal. Imagine being in that Ottoman column. One moment you're marching in formation, maybe talking to your fellow soldiers, maybe thinking about the plunder you'll take after victory. The next moment, the sky darkens with arrows. Boulders the size of horses come crashing down from the cliffs above. You hear screaming, not from the enemy, but from your own comrades being crushed, pierced, pulverized. You try to raise your shield, but the arrows are coming from multiple directions. You try to form ranks, but the terrain makes it impossible. The valley floor becomes slippery with blood. Horses are panicking, throwing their riders, trampling fallen soldiers. Your commanders are shouting orders, but nobody can hear them over the chaos. And then, when the initial shock has done its work, when the Ottoman formation has been thrown into complete disarray, that's when Skanderbeg's infantry charged. These weren't heavily armored knights. They were Albanian Highlanders, tough mountain warriors who had been fighting in this terrain since childhood. They knew how to move through the rocky slopes at speed, they knew how to strike hard and fast, and they were highly motivated because they were fighting for their homeland, their families, their freedom. The psychological impact of this charge cannot be overstated. The Ottomans, already reeling from the initial ambush, now faced waves of screaming warriors emerging from the forests like demons. Medieval combat was brutal under the best circumstances, but this was a nightmare. Close quarters fighting in a confined space where superior numbers meant nothing because you couldn't maneuver, couldn't retreat, couldn't even see the full scope of what was happening. The Ottoman cavalry, which should have been their greatest advantage, became a liability. Horses are powerful weapons on open ground, but in narrow mountain passes with loose rocks, steep slopes and panicked infantry everywhere, they're basically useless. Many cavalry units couldn't even properly engage. Some tried to retreat back through the valley, only to find their own infantry blocking the way, creating a catastrophic traffic jam of terrified men and horses. Others tried to climb the slopes to attack Skanderbeg's positions, but horses can't charge uphill effectively, especially not in mountainous terrain. They became easy targets for Albanian archers and spearmen positioned above them. Historical accounts from the period describe the battle as an absolute slaughter. The Ottoman forces, despite their numerical superiority, were being systematically destroyed. Small groups tried to form defensive positions, but Skanderbeg's men would isolate these groups and overwhelm them one by one. The Albanian warriors used their knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect, appearing where the Ottomans least expected, striking hard, then melting back into the landscape before a coordinated response could be organized. This wasn't a battle in the traditional sense, it was a carefully orchestrated massacre, a military operation executed with precision and ruthless efficiency. Now, let's talk about the commanders, because their decisions during this chaos were crucial. Ishak Bey and Hamza Kastrioti realized pretty quickly that they had walked into a trap, but by then it was too late. They tried to rally their forces, tried to organize a fighting retreat, but the geography worked against them at every turn. Some sources suggest that Hamza, Skanderbeg's nephew, fought with particular desperation, perhaps knowing that failure meant not just military defeat, but personal humiliation. He had chosen the Ottoman side over his own family, and now that choice was literally killing him and thousands of men under his command. The irony must have been crushing. Trained by his uncle's enemies, using tactics his uncle had once taught the Ottomans, now being systematically destroyed by that same uncle using those same tactics against him. As the battle raged, Skanderbeg demonstrated why he was considered one of the greatest military minds of his era. He didn't just set the ambush and let it play out, he actively managed the battle, moving units where they were needed, exploiting every opening, pressing the attack wherever the Ottomans showed weakness. He understood that in this type of engagement, maintaining momentum was everything. If he gave the Ottomans time to regroup, time to use their numbers effectively, the battle could turn against him. So he kept the pressure relentless, wave after wave, attack after attack, never letting the enemy catch their breath. The battle lasted several hours, though for the soldiers fighting it must have felt like an eternity. Medieval combat was exhausting, swinging swords and axes, wearing armor, fighting on uneven ground. It drained men quickly, but the Albanians had the advantage of rotation. Fresh troops could move up from the heights while exhausted units pulled back. The Ottomans had no such luxury. They were trapped in the valley, fighting for survival, with nowhere to rest, nowhere to regroup. Fatigue became another weapon in Skanderbeg's arsenal. As Ottoman soldiers grew tired, their defenses weakened, their reactions slowed, and they became easier targets for Albanian blades. By late afternoon, the Ottoman army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. What remained were scattered groups of survivors trying desperately to escape the valley. Some made it out, fleeing back toward Ottoman territory with tales of the disaster. Many didn't. The casualty figures for the Battle of Albulena are staggering. Estimates suggest that between 15,000 and 20,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed, with thousands more wounded or captured. That's a casualty rate of 40 to 50%, which in medieval warfare is catastrophic. For context, most medieval armies would break and flee if they suffered casualties of 10 to 15%. The Ottomans lost nearly half their force. Albanian casualties, by contrast, were minimal, probably a few hundred dead and wounded. This wasn't just a victory, it was one of the most lopsided military defeats in Ottoman history. The aftermath of the battle sent shockwaves through the region. Remember, this is 1457, just 4 years after Mehmed the Conqueror had taken Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire was supposed to be invincible, unstoppable, the rising superpower of Europe and the Middle East. And yet here was this small Albanian principality, with a fraction of the res. Horses, a fraction of the population, absolutely humiliating one of the Sultan's major armies. The political ramifications were enormous. Other Balkan states and European powers took notice. If Skanderbeg could do this, maybe the Ottomans weren't as invincible as everyone thought. It gave hope to resistance movements across the region, it complicated Ottoman military planning, and it seriously damaged Mehmed's prestige. For Skanderbeg personally, Albulena cemented his reputation as a military genius. Pope Calixtus III called him the athlete of Christ. European courts celebrated him as a champion of Christendom against the Muslim Ottoman threat, and his fame spread across the continent. Stories of his victories were told and retold, often with exaggeration, but the core truth remained. This man had figured out how to consistently defeat Ottoman armies, despite being vastly outnumbered. His tactics at Albulena, using terrain, ambush, and psychological warfare, became studied by military commanders for generations. In many ways, Skanderbeg was ahead of his time, using principles of guerrilla warfare that wouldn't be formally theorized for centuries. But let's dig deeper into why this battle was so devastating from a military tactics perspective. The Ottomans had a military system that had conquered vast territories from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf. Their janissaries were elite infantry, their Sipahi cavalry was feared across Europe, their artillery had breached the walls of Constantinople. So how did Skanderbeg achieve such a complete victory? The answer lies in understanding the limitations of even the best military systems. Ottoman tactics were optimized for certain types of warfare, particularly siege warfare and large-scale open-field battles. They excelled at overwhelming fortifications with superior numbers and artillery, at using coordinated cavalry and infantry attacks to break enemy lines, at sustained campaigns of attrition. But Skanderbeg refused to fight that kind of war. By choosing the battlefield at Albulena, Skanderbeg neutralized almost every Ottoman advantage. Their numerical superiority, useless when the terrain prevented them from deploying more than a fraction of their forces at once. Their cavalry, nearly ineffective in narrow mountain passes. Their artillery, they couldn't even get it into position before the battle started, and even if they could, you can't effectively use cannons when the enemy is on steep slopes above you. Their logistical system, compromised because supply lines through hostile territory were constantly harassed by Albanian raiders. Skanderbeg understood asymmetric warfare instinctively. He knew he couldn't match the Ottomans in a conventional fight, so he simply refused to fight conventionally. The intelligence gathering before the battle was also crucial, though it often gets overlooked in dramatic retellings. Skanderbeg had an extensive network of scouts and spies throughout Albany. He knew when the Ottoman army was coming, he knew its size, he knew its route, he probably even knew the names of its commanders. This intelligence advantage allowed him to prepare the ambush site perfectly, positioning his forces days in advance, ensuring they had adequate supplies, setting up multiple layers of attack. The Ottomans, by contrast, were operating in hostile territory where the local population supported Skanderbeg. Their intelligence was limited, unreliable, and they were essentially marching blind into a region where every shepherd, every farmer, every villager was a potential informant for the enemy. There's also the psychological dimension of the battle that's worth exploring. Skanderbeg didn't just want to defeat the Ottoman army, he wanted to terrify them, to make future Ottoman commanders think twice before invading Albania. The brutality of the ambush served this purpose. Survivors would return to Ottoman territory with stories of the massacre, of how a massive army had been destroyed in hours, of how the Albanian mountains had swallowed thousands of soldiers. This psychological warfare made future Ottoman campaigns more difficult because commanders and soldiers would be nervous, cautious, more likely to see threats in every valley and behind every ridge. Fear is a powerful weapon, and Skanderbeg wielded it masterfully. The role of terrain in medieval warfare cannot be overstated, and Albulena is a perfect case study. Modern military theory emphasizes combined arms operations, air superiority, technological advantages, but in the medieval period, geography was often the decisive factor. Armies had to march on foot or horseback. They couldn't communicate instantly. They couldn't call in airstrikes or artillery support from miles away. If you controlled the terrain, you controlled the battle. Skanderbeg understood this intimately. Growing up in Albania, he knew every mountain pass, every valley, every defensible position. This wasn't abstract knowledge from maps, it was lived experience. He had hunted in these mountains, traveled these paths, fought in these valleys. When he looked at the terrain around Albulena, he didn't just see rocks and trees, he saw a weapon that could multiply his force several times over. Let's also consider what happened to the key figures after the battle. Hamza Kastrioti, Skanderbeg's nephew, who had led the Ottoman forces, survived the battle but was captured. This created an incredibly awkward situation. Skanderbeg now had his own nephew as a prisoner, a nephew who had just led an army trying to kill him and destroy his homeland. According to some accounts, Skanderbeg offered Hamza the chance to switch sides again, to return to the Albanian cause. But Hamza refused. He remained loyal to the Ottomans, which speaks to the complex nature of loyalties in this period. Eventually, Hamza was either executed or died in captivity, depending on which historical source you believe. It's a tragic footnote. Ode to the battle, illustrating how the Ottoman-Albanian conflict tore families apart and forced impossible choices on people caught between two worlds. Isak Bey, the other Ottoman commander, also survived, but his career was effectively destroyed. Losing an army of 40,000 men is not the kind of failure that gets overlooked in an empire as vast and complex as the Ottomans. He was recalled to Constantinople, possibly punished, certainly humiliated, and never given another major command. In the brutal meritocracy of the Ottoman military system, catastrophic defeat meant the end of advancement, if not worse. The Sultan needed scapegoats, someone to blame for this disaster, and the commanders who had walked into Skanderbeg's trap were the obvious choices. For the Ottomans, Albulena represented more than just a military defeat. It exposed a fundamental problem in their Balkan strategy. The empire had conquered vast territories, but holding them was proving difficult when local populations resisted and when leaders like Skanderbeg could inspire effective resistance. The Ottomans would continue to campaign against Albania, sending army after army, but Skanderbeg continued to defeat them or avoid them through guerrilla tactics for another decade and a half until his death in 1468. Only after Skanderbeg died did the Ottomans finally succeed in fully incorporating Albania into their empire, and even then, Albanian resistance continued sporadically for years. The legacy of the Battle of Albulena extends far beyond the immediate military consequences. In Albanian national consciousness, it became a defining moment, proof that a small nation could resist a great empire through courage, clever tactics, and leadership. Skanderbeg became Albania's national hero, a symbol of independence and resistance that remains powerful even today. His image appears on Albanian currency, there are statues of him throughout the country, and the battle is taught in Albanian schools as a pivotal moment in their history. The story has been told and retold through poetry, music, art, and literature for over 500 years. From a military history perspective, Albulena is studied as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare and the effective use of terrain. Military academies have analyzed Skanderbeg's tactics, drawing lessons about how smaller forces can defeat larger ones through superior planning, knowledge of terrain, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The battle demonstrates principles that remain relevant in modern warfare, that numbers aren't everything, that morale matters, that choosing when and where to fight can be more important than how many soldiers you have, that understanding your enemy's doctrine allows you to predict and counter their moves. The religious dimension of the conflict also shouldn't be ignored, though it's easy to oversimplify. This wasn't just Christians versus Muslims. The situation was more complex than that. Skanderbeg had been raised Muslim during his time with the Ottomans, but converted back to Christianity when he defected. Many of his Albanian supporters were Christians, but some were Muslims who simply opposed Ottoman rule. The Ottomans, meanwhile, employed Christian vassals and allies in their Balkan campaigns. Religious identity certainly mattered. Christian Europe celebrated Skanderbeg as a defender of Christendom, but the conflict was fundamentally about Albanian independence and resistance to foreign domination, with religion serving as one of several identity markers rather than the sole cause of conflict. It's worth noting how close this battle came to never happening at all, if the Ottoman commanders had been more cautious, if they had scouted the valley more thoroughly, if they had chosen a different route, if they had waited for additional reinforcements, the outcome could have been very different. History often turns on small decisions that seem insignificant at the time, but have enormous consequences. The choice to march through that particular valley on that particular day led to one of the worst defeats in Ottoman military history. It's a reminder that in warfare, arrogance and overconfidence can be deadlier than enemy swords. The human cost of the battle is sometimes lost in discussions of strategy and tactics. 15,000 to 20,000 men died in that valley over the course of a few hours. Each one was a person with a family, hopes, fears, dreams. Many were conscripts who had no choice about being there, ordinary farmers and tradesmen forced into military service by the Ottoman system. They died terrified and far from home, their bodies left in a foreign valley. War is often glorified in history, but the reality is brutal and tragic. The Albanian victory was strategically brilliant, but it was also a slaughterhouse where thousands of human beings were killed in ways that were up close, personal, and horrific. Skanderbeg's ability to maintain Albanian unity was almost as impressive as his military victories. The Albanian clans were famously fractious, prone to internal feuds and rivalries. Getting them to cooperate on anything was difficult. Getting them to maintain a united front against the Ottomans for 25 years was nearly miraculous. Skanderbeg used a combination of charisma, political skill, military success, and sometimes force to keep the Albanian Confederation together. Every victory like Albulena strengthened his position, proved his leadership, and made it harder for dissenting clans to argue for accommodation with the Ottomans. In this sense, the battle had important domestic political consequences, not just military ones. As we wrap up this incredible story, let's consider what the Battle of Albulena teaches us about leadership, strategy, and the nature of conflict. Skanderbeg succeeded not because he had superior resources, he didn't. Not because he had more men, he was vastly outnumbered. He succeeded because he understood his strengths and his enemy's weaknesses, because he chose his battles carefully, because he used every advantage available to him, and because he never tried to fight the kind of war his enemy wanted. These principles apply far beyond medieval battlefields. In business, in politics, in personal challenges, the ability to reframe the conflict, to change the rules of engagement, to turn apparent weaknesses into strengths, these are timeless strategic insights. The Battle of Albulena reminds us that David really can beat Goliath, but not through direct confrontation. David wins by refusing to fight Goliath's battle, by using a sling instead of a sword, by staying at range instead of closing for hand-to-hand combat. Skanderbeg did the same thing, on a massive scale, with 8,000 warriors and the mountains of Albania as his weapons. It's a story of intelligence triumphing over brute force, of preparation defeating improvisation, of a leader who understood that the greatest military victories come not from simply being stronger, but from being smarter, more adaptable, and more willing to think outside conventional boundaries. So the next time someone tells you that might makes right, that superior numbers always win, individuals can't make a difference against overwhelming odds. Remember September 2nd, 1457. Remember a valley in Albania where 8,000 men destroyed an army 5 times their size. Remember Skanderbeg, the general who turned the Ottoman Empire's strengths into fatal weaknesses. Remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the underdog doesn't just win, they dominate so completely that the victory echoes through the centuries. That's the story of Albulena, one of the most brutal, one-sided and tactically brilliant battles in medieval history, and a testament to the power of strategic genius over raw military might.